Spotlights. This is the podcast for the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology. And as usual, I'm your host, Sam Mickey. And this week, I'm really happy to welcome onto the show Craig Patterson. Craig, thanks for making time for us.
Thank you, Sam. I really look forward to our discussion.
Yeah, me too. I learned about you and your work from John Grimm, and I know you two have been in contact. And there was a few really interesting points of connection, and one being that I currently live in the San Francisco Bay Area. You grew up around here, and also that you had a very formative experience in India in Auroville, and I went to the California Institute of Integral Studies for my doctoral degree, and that was founded really in the lineage of Sri Aurobindo and Haridas Chowdhury. And so you're very studied in that as well, and that's what goes on in Auroville, of course. It's a very special place, oriented around Aurobindo, the mother, Haridas Chowdhury, and integral philosophy. And but you've also done a lot of work in the environmental sphere alongside that. So really excited to chat with you. I wonder if you can give just a brief introduction for our listeners and viewers of who you are, what you do.
Certainly. Um, well, I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I grew up Unitarian, and I was very involved with LRY, Liberal Religious Youth, which was the beginning of my social activism as well. In 1963, there was a Proposition 14 that was on the ballot by the realtors to be able to discriminate on anything they wanted to. And we knew it was unconstitutional, so we fought it. It won and was overturned because it was unconstitutional.
Mhm.
And then also anti war. But we were also doing encounter groups and sensitivity trainings back then in the mid 60s with LRY. So there was an openness that I had when I had the opportunity to go to Callison College, where the sophomore class was to be spent in Bangalore, India.
Mm.
And I never felt any internal conflicts in terms of my values. I was a sponge that wanted to learn different ways, different approaches. And India was an incredible experience. The program, we had one professor come with us from Stockton, and then the rest were Indian professors. And it couldn't have been a better program, as far as I'm concerned, for really being able to understand differences of culture by
Mhm.
immersing yourself within it. And I was able to spend a number of weekends in Pondicherry and at Auroville. I saw the mother come out on a balcony once for a Darshan celebration with 10,000 people in the streets,
Wow.
and she didn't say a word. And it was powerful. It was very, very powerful. And Auroville had just started the year before in 67.
Oh, right.
So so it was very, very rudimentary and all, but inspiring, um, definitely inspiring. And when I came back from India, I wanted to study Eastern philosophy and humanistic psychology. But Callison didn't really know what to do with us because we were the charter class.
Hmm.
So they said, well, you can take psychology classes at the College of Pacific, which wanted to teach about rats and Skinner boxes and
Right.
all. And I said, no thanks. I'm out of here. And I did an about face and studied Buckminster Fuller my senior year
Mm.
and built a geodesic dome
Oh.
for my senior project. So I've thought about this often, how my life might have been different had I been able to get into Sonoma State at the time, which was the school for humanistic psychology,
Mm.
and in the early 70s. But they wouldn't look at somebody who was already in a 4-year school because everybody wanted to go there. So anyway, that was the turn that I took. I also was a river guide starting my junior year in college. And the river is a wonderful teacher.
Mm.
To be able to read water and to come to a rapid and see your through line and then deal with the individual obstacles. It's always an interplay between the big picture and the little picture. And it's a metaphor, I think, for life
Yeah.
that's extremely important. Um, and then I had an opportunity to come to the Rogue River in Oregon, and I just said, I'm home. I love this forest. I love these mountains. I love these clean rivers. And I moved to McKinsey Bridge 50 years ago,
Oh,
actually. I haven't always lived here, but I've maintained this place as my home base. And environmental issues became more and more important. I worked in a labor-intensive forestry cooperative. Um, I've done many, many different kinds of work over my career, mostly around energy, renewable and conservation, and forestry and construction, and the interface between those three. And so far, that and a buck 50 will buy you half a cup of coffee because nobody's interested in the big picture.
that's true.
Nobody's interested in generalists.
Yeah.
People are only interested in specialists. And thus, it's very difficult often to have an in-depth conversation with with people, even if they have multiple PhDs, because the breadth and depth is not rewarded as it once was,
Yeah.
in my experience.
Yeah, yeah, definitely in my experience as well, and certainly I think the trend in academia is only deeper and deeper into hyper specialization, and so it seems like it's only getting worse in certain respects. Of course, there's certain places like the California Institute of Integral Studies that emphasize integration, synthesis, big picture thinking, but that's kind of the exception that proves the rule. This
Mhm.
year, like, well, there is this one school here, and there's a couple places here and there, but by and large, that kind of overemphasis on specialization is a big problem. And especially, I mean, one of the things that's a constant theme in the podcast is when people separate the world of religion and spirituality from the world of nature, environment, ecology. And of course, that's exactly what we're trying to bring together here. And
Mhm.
because sometimes people are like, "Oh no, I'm a bit of a generalist. I do physics and chemistry and
Mhm.
biology." Like, okay, well, where's faith? Where's spirituality? Where's religion?
Mhm.
And so those are all coming together for you.
Mhm.
And so I wonder if you could speak a little bit to your love of integral thinking, and because I don't get to talk to enough people who are into Sri Aurobindo, Hardus Chowdhury, the mother, and so that's it's an exciting thing to engage with. And I don't know if a lot of people even know who these names refer to.
Mhm. No, I think you're right, and it's unfortunate, because I think that if integration and synthesis was the goal, not right or wrong, not good or
Yeah.
bad, integration and synthesis, because that requires a diversity of thought and opinion. And it encourages that so that there can be integration and synthesis. And I would go so far as to say that even in science, it's very thin these days because it's more about groupthink than it is about integration, synthesis, or independent think.
Hmm.
And in my own experience, and in forestry, I have hands-on experience. I've done a little firefighting. I've worked with a labor-intensive forestry cooperative. I've milled lumber on site with portable sawmills, and I
Hmm.
have a portable mill. I have also given a paper in Washington, D.C. for the National Roundtable on Sustainable Forests in 2005. And that effort was an attempt to look at sustainability relative to forestry. And even the Forest Service comments were talking about the integration of environment, economics, and society.
Hmm.
And the majority of authors identified that as the target, and then it gets no airtime. None, zero.
Right.
I've tried to push it. I was the least paid speaker of seven in terms of giving papers, and I probably spent more time trying to push it than anybody for no money, and it's gone nowhere. Um, and one of the there's a couple things that I'm working on right now. One of them has to do with extreme wildfires.
Hmm.
And I can use this as an example of how we should be integrating our thinking rather than siloing it
Right.
and dissecting it and not seeing the whole picture. And that is that, the standard line is we're experiencing extreme wildfires because of climate change and fire suppression.
Right.
Well, climate change is not myopic. And C.M. Countryman did a research in the 60s where he said that if you measured the temperature in a clear cut at 2 in the afternoon at 153 degrees, and you measure the temperature in an intact forest on the floor and in the canopy at 87 degrees, there's a world of difference even before climate change.
Right.
Climate change is going to increase that difference not only with clear cuts but with plantations as well.
Hmm.
So, that isn't a monolithic, even though it's presented monolithically. The other thing they talk about is reducing fuel load.
Right.
Most of the time, there's more residue on the forest floor after logging than before.
Hmm.
And in the 80s in Oregon, 1/3 of the wildfires were slopovers as a result of trying to burn up that slash on the unit.
Oh, really?
That's correct.
Hmm.
And one study showed that the amount of residue left in 1965, I think, or 66, in California, Oregon, and Washington was the equivalent of more than 7 million cords of wood.
Wow.
And it got more as the cut went up.
Right.
So we are focusing, in my mind, on the on the wrong focus. Climate change is real. It's far more real after industrial logging. So we need to be focusing on shade, not
Hmm.
on fuel reduction. That shade is critically important in order to maintain a more constant temperature.
Right.
And then also wind becomes a factor after the trees are cut, because when the trees are standing, the wind largely goes over the top.
Right.
So wind is what is really driving these extreme wildfires. And when our focus is wrong, our solutions are wrong, things will get worse, which they are. And I wrote a piece called Wildfires and Wild Excuses that I'm trying to get people to read, and it's got like 25 or 30 references. It's well documented. But the problem is that I indict the industry.
Hmm.
I make the industry complicit with the problem, and my paycheck doesn't depend upon that. So I can say that, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And so we just, our evolution has been stifled by greed and by a focus on economics that is not holistic, that is very myopic, and that it essentially privatizes profits and socializes liabilities.
Right.
That is not a sustainable path.
Right. No, not at all. Well, so the it is very frustrating when people treat, because I know this has been the case with like Governor Gavin Newsom in California. Wildfires break out. He's just like climate change, climate change, climate change. I'm like, yeah, you're not wrong, but there's all these other factors involved, and it's weird to center climate change when bad forest management is really the key here. And so, but you're saying it's not just a question then of prescribed burns and reducing fuel load. And so then what would be the way to go to provide things like more windbreaks, more shade? Should people be doing more planting of trees or a different way of logging?
We need to stop logging big trees,
Yeah.
period. We need to recognize, I think the one distinction that rarely gets discussed that I think is key is understanding the difference between the beneficial surface fire
Mm,
and the more often cataclysmic crown fire.
mm,
When the indigenous cultures were lighting fires, they were lighting surface fires for multiple reasons. Fuel reduction was probably one of their understandings, but to think that we can come in and do the same thing now after 90% of the big trees are gone is penny wise and pound foolish.
right.
So, but also another issue is fire suppression. Fire suppression is a bad joke.
Yeah.
We can fight surface fires. We cannot fight crown fires. With the conversion of multi-story species forests into even-age plantations, we've effectively eliminated beneficial surface fires from even happening.
Hmm.
And there's more and more research that's showing that when a fire does hit a plantation, it wipes it out.
Hmm.
It's not a mosaic like it is in an intact forest in valleys and hills, etc. So, and when you realize that when you're oftentimes when they're doing fire line, you're looking at 2, 3 feet wide down to the soil, and then realize that the Eagle Creek fire about 5 years ago jumped the Columbia the River 3 miles.
Wow.
So, to not recognize that the dynamics have so completely changed with fire because of our alterations, and to not realize that, I mean, the fire in my valley that caused evacuation, second fire in 3 years, um, it cost $87 million to fight.
Wow.
And they were taking planes and going to Blue River Reservoir and getting water and bringing it and dumping it here. Meanwhile, where most of the houses were that they were trying to protect up North Bank Road was basically right next to the river.
Hmm.
And I tried to suggest, why don't you have pumping stations along the river with unlimited water and bring the lines up past the houses to protect them, at a much less cost? But nobody listens to me.
Well, and what do you think that is? Is it just that the industry just isn't listening to citizens, or is it the way that profit motive is affecting them? Because there's some good solutions out there, and some reason they're just not being implemented.
I think that the best solution is one that buildings in the woods need to have metal roofs and metal siding.
Mm,
No excuses, and best to have an airspace so that if there is a fire, there's some air transfer that will reduce the heat
mm,
transferring to the inside of the house. But I also think that we need to think in terms of how do we bring back surface fire into the equation?
Right.
And I think pruning lower branches is one way to think about that.
Mm,
How effective it will be in a plantation, probably dubious.
right.
But in a more mixed stand, to really try to focus on how do we bring back that surface fire component, then, but it's going to take many, many, many decades before, because we have just cut way too much, you know.
Yeah.
To put it in perspective, where I live, Lane County and Douglas County to the south of me, which encompasses most of the Willamette National Forest and the Umpqua National Forest, cut more timber between 1950 and 1990 than 48 states in the nation.
Wow. Wow.
10% of Oregon's land base cut more than 48 states for 40 years.
Wow. That is a crazy statistic. Wow.
And it's like we are suffering the consequences of that now, as is California, because you cut all your forests down.
Yeah.
You know, it's but until we change our thinking and recognize, I think what I'm trying to say in terms of the bigger picture, and not being myopically focused on fuel reduction to the exclusion of shade and wind,
Yeah.
um, we're toast.
Yeah. Yeah, and it really is striking. You know, you mentioned this is something that's gonna be decades and decades, even if we work hard at it, decades and decades of work before we can properly restore these ecosystems. And it's tough. I was talking to somebody recently, a professor in the environmental science policy and management program at the University of California, Berkeley, and talking about forests, and I was just like, well, but we can fix it soon, right? And because I'm, always trying to be optimistic. And he was like, well, we spent a couple hundred years destroying these forests. It's going to take a couple hundred years to restore them. And I was like, oh no, this is a very long-term project. And to know that people still aren't paying attention to the bigger issues involved, it's very disheartening to say the least. And like, well, we're still just blaming climate change and focusing on fuel reduction. All these other issues are just not being addressed.
It's true. And I've been spending a lot of time thinking about what are some of the root dysfunctions? What are
Mm,
some of the root causes of the problem? And how does it relate to Eastern and Western thought? And there's a number of them that have come up, um, for me. I think one is that Indian philosophy is embedded in the concept unity in diversity,
hmm
and that nature is the master. Whereas our culture, domination and the illusion of control is the master. And so I think it becomes classic in the Einstein words, you can't solve a problem with the same thinking that created it.
Right.
As long as we impose domination and the illusion of control on any solution, we can't get there from here.
Yeah.
And how do we make that transition? I wish I knew, because for the most part, I can't find people who can even really even discuss it.
Right.
So that's one big one. And I think, um, another one for me is the Indian four stages of life.
Mm,
That you're a child, you're a student, you're a householder, and you're a sannyasi. And that living each stage fully is its own reward. Um, and it's kind of a different orientation to life than most in the Western culture, I
mm.
think. Um, and it, to me, for me, it's led me to thinking about that success is not monetary. Success is more, how is my soul and spirit unfolding
Hmm.
in ways of integration and synthesis? And that's a problem when you go to the bank, but it's not a problem when you're sitting on the river or in
Right,
nature.
exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's a big one. Like for our society, we forget that, you know, success might not be monetary success, but might be something like the development of your soul or your spirituality. I'm not sure when we lost that, but it's been gone for a good amount of time.
I I agree. I agree. And I think the other thing too that comes out of the East that I think is essential is that service in action
Mm.
is is critically important to our soul development, and that being in service is an antidote to despair, to, so many ailments that we experience in spades in the West. And, obviously Gandhi took it to an extreme success in his commitment to love in action, and being not afraid to confront what was wrong, what was negative. But I think it's a universal truth that the more that we're connected to actions that are in service in some way, in some form, um, the more fulfilling and the more peace we can find in our lives.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's being borne out time and time again with new studies. They're saying, like, look, people who do service work, it alleviates all kinds of symptoms of anxiety and depression, and so people are always wondering, like, what can I do to get out of my mental health slump? Like, be of service. And sometimes they just want to go inward, and they forget that no, actually going outward can really help the inside, and just get out there, and whatever it is, if you can be of service to your larger community, then all of a sudden happiness, and it's that easy.
Well, and I think also knowing that we all have a direct connection to the one, the other thing from India that I think is really important is understanding the interplay between vidya and avidya,
Mm,
the one and the many, the individual and the collective, and understanding how um, it's not black and white like it is here.
right.
Like when we put a label on something, it's black and white. It's no longer on a continuum. And oftentimes as much for the doctor as it is for the patient.
Hmm.
But I think it does a disservice because consciousness is evolving all the time. And that the interplay between the one and the many is a constant aspect of our lives and is beneficial. It's not a negative at all. It's how we see the bigger perspective and attempt to integrate it by not being so ego bound in our perceptions.
Right. Yeah, I think that's thinking of consciousness as something that's evolving really changes how you approach the world. And you realize, like, okay, a lot of these things I see as just black and white are actually in a process of transformation, so they're not so separate after all.
Mhm. Exactly, exactly. And how do we stay open to as many new possibilities that might come into being? But I think that understanding trends And as said, I think Jung was one of the probably the best for me bridge between Western and Eastern thought.
Mm.
And I really appreciate his perspective a lot. I appreciate the collective unconscious aspects of his
Hmm.
work. But even more, I love the quote: enlightenment isn't about imaging figures of light, but about making the darkness conscious.
Right.
And I think that that really speaks to his focus on doing shadow work. And how do we do shadow work? And how do we not see how darkness is increasing in spades today?
Yeah.
And where is the light coming from? And where can we accentuate, the light? One of the other aspects of forestry that I've been trying to suggest and push is that we need to return to the CCC camps,
Hmm.
the Civilian Conservation Corps of the 1930s that got us out of the Great Depression
Hmm.
and gave people homes, and maybe not houses, but maybe it was a dormitory or a tent, or but they had shelter and they had jobs, and people need both.
Right.
And if, back then, the official unemployment rate was 24-25%.
Hmm.
I believe today that most rural forested communities are there if everyone was counted. But unemployment statistics only count you if you're just off unemployment insurance.
Right.
So when you look at the fact that between 1990 and 92 in Oregon, Washington, and Idaho, and western Montana, 364 mills closed down, and I think it was either 20 or 40,000 primary family wage scale jobs went away, and they've never come back.
Wow.
So, part of it is our own, I'll say, stupidity, that we allow data like unemployment numbers be so entirely bogus, and nobody addresses it, you
Yeah, no,
know?
that's true. Yeah, that's a big problem. And yeah, I think the numbers really seem to confuse people. As long as they see the unemployment numbers dropping, like, oh, then things are going just fine. Our economy is doing great. We're bouncing back. Like, what are these numbers actually signifying? They're not really signifying a healthy economy at all.
Exactly. And one of the things about going being in India in 1968, 69,
Hmm.
I remember clearly thinking, God, I'm so glad I live in America. There's not homelessness like there is in India. They're not
Hmm.
beggars like there is in India. It was just, and voila, we're there now.
Yeah.
I mean, and it's getting worse. The trends are getting worse. And, the people who get the paycheck seem to be divorced from the trends, you know?
Yeah.
Um, how do we, one of my favorite quotes from Terry Tempest Williams
Mm.
is when she said, "The eyes of the future are looking back at us, and they are praying that we see beyond our own time."
Mm. Yeah.
Because we're using it up,
Yeah.
and the waste is off the charts. And when we define success in terms of opulence and conspicuous consumption, we can't get to sustainability.
Yeah. Yeah. And for some people, sustainability means how can we make sure that everybody gets to have opulence? And everybody should be able to live in the way that like an over-consuming United States citizen gets to live.
That's
Like,
right.
oh no, we should not. be trying to globalize this like vicious lifestyle. And especially when you think of perspectives from Hindu philosophy, or for that matter, Confucianism, Taoism, all the ancients would look at our society and be like, you're clearly unhappy. And the excess, the extravagance, the fact that you think that that's happiness is so sick and so just completely the wrong direction. So it's a thing, I wonder all the time, how do you let people know that they're so sick? They're so sick they don't even know they're sick. How do you raise that flag?
I guess, the more Thich Nahans in the world who totally embody, his total commitment to living lightly and living compassionately and and all. If living lightly on the planet was the target, um, we probably could sustain 7 billion people,
Yeah,
but we can't afford the rich,
yeah,
basically. We can't afford the millionaires and the billionaires. And it's interesting how we have become so advanced in technology, in medicine, in some ways, although I don't prescribe in a lot of it, in in communications, certainly.
yeah,
But in terms of social, it seems like we're in retrograde, you
yeah,
know, continuous wars in my lifetime, more or less.
yeah.
Um, I'm 74, and in my mind, there's no war that has been justified since World War II
Mm-hmm.
at all.
Yeah,
You know, they're all tragic for everybody, and yet, um, and I wouldn't be surprised if World War III has its beginnings in the Middle East. Um,
yeah,
I, I I wish it wasn't, but I fear that that could happen. Um, and why is it that if the deepest joy comes from inside rather than anything outside, why are we so hard pressed to manifest that and focus on that
mm-hmm.
rather than on the glitz and the opulence and the things?
Yeah, yeah. It's a great question, and such a symptom of just a culture of decadence where we have this massive amount of economic productivity, all this technological innovation, and somehow morals regressing, and our sense of spirituality regressing. And you just think like, okay, this is very much collapse of the Roman Empire kind of energy. It's like, wow, look at all this incredible extravagant wealth, and look at how deeply cynical and unhappy everybody is. And I don't know what's going to turn that around. So I wonder, in a situation like this, one of the questions I like to talk to a lot of people about is what gives you hope in such a dark, difficult time. What gives you hope? And a fair answer is nothing. That's there's a lot of ways to answer that, and and hope. It's a complicated word. It's a bit of a noun. It's a bit of a verb. So I wonder what, if anything, gives you hope amidst this kind of darkness.
Well, my first answer to that is that I think that um, it's one of the hardest spiritual lessons to learn, to not be attached to the fruits of your actions.
Mm,
And that for me, what gives me hope is continually trying to be engaged in the Northwest Energy Plan, to be trying to be engaged with, you know, cutting edge conservation efforts, to be engaged in how do we rebuild the economy in rural communities. At the same time, um, the successes, here's another story. In 85, 86, I was one of the main people that was involved in an effort in the McKinsey Valley to respond to the beginning of the lottery monies for economic development.
Hmm.
And then the mayor of Eugene, Brian Obey, wanted to put all the money into the Riverfront Research Park for college graduates. And Tom Forrester and I wrote a letter to the editor saying, wait a minute, don't rural communities have equal, if not greater, need for economic development assistance? And out of that came a year and a half effort with over 150 people involved, where we developed a report called Abundant Resources, Abundant Opportunities, a grassroots attempt to define a sustainable economic foundation based on balance between forestry, agriculture, tourism, and geothermal development.
Hmm.
Many people said it was ahead of its time. We never got any funding, and I gave a copy to Martin Goebel of Sustainable Northwest, probably in 88 or 89. And he doesn't work with us one nickel. He turns around and creates healthy forests, healthy communities, and industry effort.
Hmm.
And so it's like um, we've now had a fire, two fires, 500 houses burned down. There's an attempt to how do we rebuild the valley and the community? And I'm trying to bring back this notion that we need to focus on jobs and sustainable jobs because the school district up here, K through 12, has 170 students.
Oh,
It used to have 800 to 1,000
wow.
when there were jobs. So,
Yeah.
when you don't have jobs, you can't have young families. And, but the amount of resistance I get sometimes, and I back up when I get it. I don't try to push through it anymore at all. I'm too old for that. But it's how do you wait until it comes again up again on the guitar, so to speak?
Right.
You know, what is there? Where is the next opportunity to try to move and push something forward? And that's what I've done. But I'm running out of optimism. I have to admit.
Yeah, I think that's fair, and I think some kind of balance between optimism and pessimism seems to be the appropriate mood for our time. Because to be optimistic is really at this point to be just naive, and but to be pessimistic is just to give up, right? And so I really appreciate that point, especially that it's about engagement without being attached to the fruits of your action. That's such a great lesson. And of course, the Bhagavad Gita, of Arjuna just dejected in battle, and Krishna has to kind of explain to him, hey, you do your duty
Mhm,
and don't worry about the fruits. Fully committed, fully engaged,
mhm.
but not attached to the outcome, not attached to the fruits of your action. I think that's it's such a beautiful moral, and also one that's very difficult to practice. But it sounds like that's exactly what you've been doing.
I've been trying. I'm human. I certainly make mistakes, but I'm trying, and I think that that's part of the integration for me of that Eastern and Western, thought and how to um, engage. You know, one of my detriments is I never went on to get an advanced degree.
Mm.
I never found the kind of program that was holistic and really wanted to integrate in the same ways that I have tried to integrate throughout my life. And so that's a detriment because I'm not part of the club.
Right.
I can talk to anybody about the issues that I'm engaged in for days, and probably run circles around most, but I don't get invited to the table in part because I have a dissident voice. I bring up hard questions and I don't have a degree.
Yeah, no, it's a serious problem in academia and, for that matter, policy and all kinds of sectors of society is this kind of gatekeeping that if you don't have the credentials, then we're not going to listen to you. And meanwhile, if you do have the credentials, but you're very myopic in your thinking, then we'll certainly listen to you. And so people who are saying just terrible things, but they've got the degrees to back it up, they end up influencing all kinds of important decision-making processes.
Yep.
And whereas other people who are like, look, I don't have the degrees, but I'm engaged with the issues. I'm doing the
Mhm.
work, thinking big picture. Listen to me. They're like, I don't think we should. So yeah, it's a strange problem and of centuries in the making with the
Mhm.
whole idea of the modern university and that, and it's just really just a power grab in a lot of ways. I say that as somebody with a PhD.
Right.
It's like because I see it because I got into that club and you see the way those people talk to each other and you're like, you know what? There's a lot more myopia here than anybody would like to admit.
Well, and also, I see that there's a whole lot of groupthink
Hmm.
that comes out of universities these days. And group thinkers do not can't address perspectives from independent thinkers. They don't have the background, they don't have the bandwidth, they don't have the intent to try to find the integration and synthesis.
Yeah.
So they just ignore you and push you off. And I live 10 miles away from the largest and oldest Forest Service experiment
Mm,
forest in the country,
mm,
called the H.J. Andrews Experimental Forest. And I've been trying to interface with them for decades, probably 4 decades now,
mm.
and trying to bring questions of what constitutes social relevance in scientific inquiry. Because when you look at, and I've got thousands of PNW studies, I've got them over the years that I've been engaged. If you ask the question, what is the social relevance of this particular question? Um, and one one example that I can bring was at the Andrews, and there was a professor, Bill Immingham, who was doing a weekend on how do we create structural diversity in a plantation.
Mm.
And I raised my hand in the back, and he calls on me, and I said, Bill, why did you destroy that diversity in the first place? Isn't that kind of like saying we got to kill the village in order to save it? He never responded. And he can't.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a stupid question. And but it's where, and today with carbon credits, which is totally bogus. I mean, if you're going to do carbon credits, you got to start from when the forest is intact
Right.
and figure out how much carbon is being sequestered and then measure everything according to that. Anything else is a fabrication.
Yeah.
But the industry is doing all it can to continue to try to pump out profits, and it's doing a bad job
Yeah.
because not only are their forestry practices wrong and bad, but their products have all kinds of liabilities
Mm.
too. The OSB outgases, TJIs fail in under 5 minutes in a house fire, and CLTs have failed, and I believe will continue to fail because of the physic properties of fast growing wood.
Right.
But try to talk to the industry about that, and there's no dialogue.
Yeah. Anything that upsets their kind of basic assumptions. It's like we're not really ready for that. And in the meantime, we're just trying to make some profit. And if we can, bring carbon credits and things like that in the mix, whatever, we'll do what we can as long as we still make profit. And then the public at large doesn't realize that they're being bamboozled. They're like, oh, carbon credits. Okay. The industry's fixing everything. Nope, not at all. That's
Exactly.
it's a scam.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
I heard somebody describe carbon credits as like uh imagine if you had something like that where you had infidelity credits with your husband or wife. And you're like, oh, don't worry, I got these credits. So that means I'm allowed to go cheat on you this weekend because I got the credits for next weekend. So I won't, or like murder credits. Like, well, I decided I'm not going to murder five other people. So that means it's okay for me to murder these two people. Like, no, you're still being uh, unfaithful or you're still killing people. Like, that's not, that stuff doesn't add up the way people think it does. And this situation where people are like clear cutting a forest and then planting trees there to count as carbon offsets is just so upsetting. And that by and large the public doesn't know that they're being confused.
Exactly, and it manifests everywhere. It manifests everywhere. One of the questions that I've yet to get an answer
Mm,
on, but I think it's a good question, is why is it that those religions that view heaven in the clouds seem to trash the planet with impunity, while those religions that are, God, nature, Gaia based wouldn't dream of trashing the planet?
mhm.
What is the disconnect? Where are the fundamental disconnects in our, and I think that there's many of them, from the doctrine of discovery,
Right.
manifest destiny. Um, there's many of them that um, we need to have a truth and reconciliation effort
Yeah.
about if we're ever going to get beyond. And I wish I could see that coming, but I don't see it happening.
Yeah, yeah, I'm not sure either. But I think that is exactly what we need. I think the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is a really good model. If we
Mhm,
had something like that on like a planetary scale,
mhm.
that could provide a context for people to move forward. That does seem very unlikely, but the fact that there's a model out there is still a very hopeful kind of thing. And I'm sure the abolition of slavery seemed unlikely before it happened. Women getting the right to vote seemed unlikely before it happened, and then
Mhm,
they happened.
mhm.
And so I think a lot of our work is really just kind of praying for the impossible to happen.
That, and I think also it's about how do we envision a different future? How can we even get down into the weeds and the details,
Yeah.
you know? And I can do that, relative to the development of a CCC camp. I would love to be involved in, you know, bringing 20 people to a raw piece of land and developing the camp themselves as part of the educational process.
Mhm.
Um, but they don't listen to me.
Well, all right. Well, we have the podcast episode out, so maybe more people will listen to you. Although I don't think so. It's not. We don't have that big of a reach. We don't have millions of listeners, but there's a few, and every little bit helps to get the word out.
Indeed, and I really appreciate this opportunity, Sam. I thank you very much.
Oh, geez, yeah. Thank you, Craig. This was a treat. I really enjoyed talking with you. I'm really glad that John Grimm connected us, and always happy to speak with somebody who's invested in the work of integration, which is to me the great work of our time.
Indeed, indeed, and how can CIIS even push that? Because um, when I see some of the things that they're researching, I kind of wonder, well, are those the most important places we need to be pushing, or what? And the problem always is that if you're critical, people tune you out.
Yeah. Yeah.
And how do we try to form our criticisms in a way that there is hearing for? And I'm trying to pay more attention to that myself, because I know people tune me out. Um, but and so it goes.
And so it goes. Well, yeah, that's a good note to end on. We need to be critical, but we have to be critical in a way where we can open up dialogue instead of shutting it down. And And people need to be a little more gentle with critics and not just tune them out when they hear them, and try to open up more dialogue, more opportunities for integration and synthesis. Uh,
Amen.
yeah. Well, geez, Craig Patterson, this was a joy. Thank you so much for your
Thank
time, and thanks for everybody for tuning in. We'll be back with some more conversations for you soon. In the meantime, take care and be well.
Take care.